At a certain point in Disco Elysium, you stumble across a rusting payphone. If you pick up the phone and dial at random enough times, the amnesiac protagonist will dredge a phone number from the depths of his mind and end up calling his ex.
Hello? You're not a revolutionary, Harry. You're drunk.
Once you've started this conversation, you have no choice but to continue it. You have to select one of the bad options in front of you. If you try to put the phone down before that, the game does not let you. There's this horrifying sense of not being in control of your actions, of knowing you should stop talking, but finding yourself unable to. This is a storytelling technique made possible by the fact that it's a video game. So I was baffled when I went looking for responses and analysis of Disco Elysium online and saw multiple people saying that what makes the game so good is how well it captures the role-playing experience of a tabletop RPG. As someone who doesn't play a lot of digital games and does play a lot of tabletop, my experience of Disco Elysium was colored much more by the ways it differs from the latter. It isn't just about the literal distinction between sitting at a table with other people compared to alone at a computer. Much of my own tabletop experience has been online, mediated by Discord and Roll20 and Google Sheets. But in those cases, the digital interface is just a means by which we're accessing the game, which is itself a more abstract thing. With a computer RPG like Disco Elysium, the art and the soundtrack and the visual design of the menu is as much a part of the game as the narrative text is. A tabletop game, even a pre-written adventure, has theoretically infinite room for player creativity. Disco Elysium, for all its winding branches, is a defined object with hard boundaries. And as the opening example illustrates, this is a feature, not a bug. The game tells its story through the structure of its dialogue trees, through places where the player hits a hard edge and has no easy way out. And yet, the more I think about it, the more I agree this idea that there's something tabletop RPG-ish about Disco Elysium, or about digital role-playing games broadly, is getting at something. Part of it is the surface level, the shared language of stats and dice and level-ups and alignments. Disco Elysium's political alignment mechanic subverts that of Dungeons & Dragons, emphasizing the ways morality is always contextual and always political. Disco Elysium is an RPG in that it comes from a lineage of games that attempt to reckon with such themes. One of the core mechanics of the game is the stat checks. But the fact that Disco Elysium talks about the mechanic in those terms doesn't mean it actually has much in common with stat checks in tabletop RPGs. To begin with, I think any Disco Elysium player could tell you that the stats are characters as much as their mechanics. I have no idea what the equivalent of that would be in an analog game. It's also notable, though not unheard of, in tabletop, that the stats aren't tied to the verbs you use to interact with the world. While a stat-like physical instrument is often used for physical tasks, other times it acts as a perception skill, telling you about characters' bodies. Opportunities for action in any given situation are bespoke to the scene in question. At the most basic level, passive checks in Disco Elysium function by semi-randomly inserting or removing little bits of prose into the larger body of text. The similarity between this and how passive checks work in tabletop is tenuous at best. Succeeding at a passive in Disco Elysium is just as likely to reframe a scene's tone, emphasize a theme, or tell a joke, as it is to give the player character a diegetic advantage, which is what you'd expect from a traditional skill check. Distinct paths through the game cast different lights on the same events. This is how Disco Elysium operates on both a micro and macro scale. Something beautiful is going to happen, and in an instant that phrase becomes the beating heart of the story. Or you can never touch that wall at all. The fact that lines, motifs, and entire storylines can drop out of Disco Elysium without the narrative losing coherence is vital to what makes it work so well. The half-glimpsed edge of a quest line you never complete feels instead like a new perspective on one you have, because even when they aren't connected by in-universe events, they're bound together thematically. So passive checks and branching options are one thing, but if we're talking overlap with tabletop, what about the white and red checks, the stat rolls you choose to make as a player? I still think the dice perform a different function in a game like Disco Elysium than they do in a tabletop story game. As an aside, story game as a term here comes from the particular niche of the indie tabletop scene that I'm approaching this from. While I'm attempting throughout the video to generalize beyond this subgenre of RPG, it's worth putting my biases on the table. I'm aware that the philosophy of tabletop I'm analyzing Disco Elysium through the lens of is not universal within the hobby, but it's the one that resonates with me. It's a philosophy that's expressed well by genre-defining game Apocalypse World. Quote, "Role-playing is a conversation. You and the other players go back and forth, talking about these fictional characters in their fictional circumstances, doing whatever it is that they do. Like any conversation, you take turns, but it's not like taking turns, right? Sometimes you talk over each other, interrupt, build on each other's ideas, monopolize, and hold forth. All fine. These rules mediate the conversation. They kick in when someone says particular things, and they impose constraints on what everyone should say after. In essence, in Tabletop, the reason we turn to dice rolls, or card draws, or prompt lists is because they provide external input that keeps the conversation moving. But in Disco Elysium, that isn't the case. The developers wrote both paths through every pass-fail branch. Neither do the dice rolls in Disco Elysium serve a purely simulationist function, somehow standing in for the randomness of the real world. That's part of it, but the developers had to make decisions about what was and wasn't a roll. The inclusion of one is always a narrative choice. Calling for a dice roll is one more tool through which story is communicated in a scene. It heightens tension, tightens the focus onto a particular moment. It's less about simulating physics than it is simulating the emotional reality of the player character, in the same way that things like word choice and sentence structure can be used to do in traditional prose. Disco Elysium's rolling system uses 2 digital 6-sided dice, added together. 2d6 differs from, say, 1d12 in that the likeliest results are weighted toward the middle, rather than equally distributed across all probabilities. For example, Apocalypse World also uses 2d6 for its dice system. In that game, every roll has 3 possible results: a failure, a partial success, and a full success. Since the partial success is attached to the middle range of numbers, using 2d6 ensures that a mixed result is always the most likely. In Disco Elysium, though, while how bad and how good the outcome is varies by context, there's only ever 2 possibilities. But there are multiple difficulty levels. The easiest levels put the threshold toward the middle of the curve, so it's genuinely uncertain. Rolls that are very difficult, though, are on the outer edge of the probability curve. What's interesting about this is that a +1 bonus on the edge of the curve doesn't do as much as it does at the bottom. If you're trying to roll a 6 or higher and you have a +1, you actually only need to roll a 5 or higher. The odds of rolling a 5 on 2d6 is around 11%. On the other hand, if the threshold you're trying to make is 12, the odds of rolling an 11 on 2d6 is only 6%, so that's less of a difference. The harder the skill check, the less effect an individual +1 bonus from that cool hat or what have you will affect your probability of success. Some things in life, Disco Elysium says, are just hard, but others come down to you and how prepared you are. Granular bonuses to dice rolls can become meaningless math, but often in Disco Elysium, the non-stat-based bonuses are less important for the way they affect the roll itself than for how they highlight a narrative element's relevance to the current scene. Conceptualization. Why am I looking at this wall? +2. In the dimming light, some things become clearer. Dice do this kind of thing in Tabletop too. The process of rolling and thinking through what bonuses apply carries story content, but most dice-based RPGs leave it to the game master to decide when to call for a roll and how to talk the player through which bonuses apply. So a lot of the work to set up these moments falls on the GM rather than only on the developers. Still, some of my favorite systems are ones that give you a framework that is itself interesting. In Masks: A New Generation, a game about teenage superheroes, one of the core mechanics is what the game calls conditions. Each condition represents a negative emotional state your character might be experiencing, and each give penalties to certain roles. So every time you make a roll in Masks, always a moment where something is at stake, a moment of elevated drama, you have to stop, look at your character sheet, and ask, how are my emotions affecting me right now? The emphasis on characters' mental states helps create the kind of melodrama the game is aiming for. Disco Elysium's Thought Cabinet is an important part of the game's character customization. As you play, you're offered opportunities to add thoughts to your character, which include everything from the political alignments discussed earlier to passing fancies about in-universe pop culture. These usually give bonuses to certain stat checks, but you don't know what the mechanical effects will be until after you've chosen a thought. And this is vital to how the Thought Cabinet works. Provided you're not going out of your way to look them up online, your choice of thought will be purely based on narrative. The mechanics follow out of that. It is what is often described as fiction-first gaming. As the rulebook for Tabletop RPG Blades in the Dark puts it, quote, "In a standard board game, when you take your turn, you choose a move from one of the mechanics of the game, and then use that game system to resolve what happens. You might say, I'm going to pay 2 stone to build a second fort on my home tile. We could call this process mechanics first. What you do on your turn is pick a mechanic to engage, then resolve that mechanic. Your choices are constrained by the mechanics of the game. You might color it in with some fictional trappings like the brave citizens of Baronia heed the call to war and build a stout fort, but the fiction is secondary, its flavor added on. In other words, the fiction is brought in after the mechanics to describe what happened. In a role-playing game, it's different. When it's your turn, you say what your character does within the ongoing fictional narrative. You don't pick a mechanic first, you say something about the fiction first. Your choices in a role-playing game aren't immediately constrained by the mechanics, they're constrained by the established fictional situation. Given what I said earlier about hard edges and UI elements, you might think that video games are necessarily mechanics first, inasmuch as this is a meaningful dichotomy. But there are tons of story moments in Disco Elysium that you can miss completely that the vast majority of people don't because they're following the fiction. There's nothing mechanically forcing you to go investigate the body, but you're going to, because everything about the story is telling you to. As a player, you want to keep exploring, you want to solve the mystery. That's why you're playing the game. The systems alone don't carry it. You have to start with the fiction. In the climax of Disco Elysium, you and your detective partner Kim Kitsuragi confront the mercenaries involved in the murder. The scene always ends in violence, but if you make it here with a gun or another weapon in hand, it's on you to decide when the shooting starts. In my first playthrough, I had nothing. So even though skills were telling me not to waste time talking, I worked my way through that whole list of options, desperate to find a way to avoid bloodshed. I got shot. From what I can tell, there isn't a way through the fight where that doesn't happen, but in that moment I was convinced it was my fault, and I was going to die and have to reload. And so as the game is giving me dialogue options, I'm barely paying attention to what Harry is saying, lashing out, spouting nonsense, and then the moment comes to warn Kim that one of the enemy combatants has their gun aimed at him. The roll says, +1, the lieutenant trusts you. And I roll, and I fail it, and the narration tells me in no uncertain terms,
he does not trust you.
And I, sitting with my laptop in bed at 1 a.m., burst into tears. There'd be a way of talking about this moment, I think, that paints the contradiction between the statements as poor game design. But Harry believed that Kim trusted him. Implicating me in this incorrect belief made the emotions of the scene hit so much harder than they would have otherwise. It's expertly executed tragedy. I, as a player, liked Kim and trusted Kim and was too certain in that feeling to stop and think about whether the storytelling decisions I was making for Harry would lead Kim to like him back. Kim gets shot. In the next scene, Harry wakes up, his own gunshot wound mostly healed. You can wander into Kim's empty hotel room and
28 kilometers to the northeast, in the infirmary of Precinct 57, Lieutenant Kim Pinball Kitsuragi rests under a heart monitor. A triage sign, colored yellow, hangs from his injury record. Safe, it means. He coughs, propped up against the pillow. Why are you here? Asks the man as the cough fit resides. To inquire about the Lieutenant E. Freighter, sir. I am his partner, says Satellite Officer Jean Vicmaire, standing in the doorway. Then why are you wasting time here? Coughs Kim. He's out there, in Martinez, unsupervised, without cover. You need to get there.
He's worried about Harry. He's worried about him. He cares, and also, when it comes down to it, he does not trust him. It's such a gut-wrenching portrait of a specific interpersonal dynamic. From there, I stumbled forward into what fans at least seem to refer to as the bad ending, where Harry goes to the island alone. Where, when the people from his old life show up to judge him, they decide to leave him there. And I don't know if this is literally mechanically true, but it felt in that moment like everything could have gone differently if I'd just gotten my hands on a weapon. We've talked about tabletop role-playing games and computer role-playing games, but there is a third sibling medium that I think has relevant things to say here, and that's live-action role-play. I haven't done much LARP, but the indie LARP scene and the indie tabletop scene overlap such that I hear about it, and LARP folks often have really interesting things to say about roleplay and storytelling. In a book on LARP design, one of the contributing writers describes a distinction between plot, meaning things that had been planned by the people running the game, story, meaning things that are emergent in play, and narrative, which is, quote, an account. Narrative is what you are left with after the LARP is done, when participants look back on the plot, the story, and the character actions and try to answer the question, what happened in this LARP? The narrative of a role-playing game doesn't exist in the mechanics. It doesn't exist in the literal act of playing. It exists in our heads afterward. I can replay Disco Elysium as many times as I want and probably never recreate the exact sequence of choices that led to the narrative experience I just described. The fact that I could go digging through the source code and read all the options and they'll be the same every time doesn't make a CRPG less ephemeral than a LARP. Disco Elysium is a complicated narrative to analyze because it is not one narrative. It is a carefully honed set of tools to build one. It can be a story about a man's political radicalization or his re-entrenchment into the status quo, about him learning how to be a kinder person, or about him trying to do that and failing. My Disco Elysium, where Harry Dubois failed to earn Kim's trust, where his old colleagues left him alone and hopeless on the Martinaise coast, is just as real as any other. The fact that I know it could have gone differently doesn't change how things went for this Harry. If anything, the existence of other possibilities only makes his fate more tragic. Things didn't have to be this way, but they are. When a tabletop RPG is firing on all cylinders, when the pieces of the story you've been telling come together just right, there's a kind of magic to it. A video game uses different methods to get to this magic, but it's there all the same. And maybe it's an illusion, a magic trick. But that's the whole point.